All right, another 5 seconds. 2, 1. So we got supremacy clause. Okay, people maybe didn't spell it right, but close enough. Okay, good. Well, look, 5 of you spelled it the same way incorrectly. That's actually interesting. Damn you, autocorrect, right? I guess, okay, but you are correct. So 90% of you got that right. Very good. Someone wrote proper clause. That is not correct. Okay, so let me also recap some of the questions. I asked you to do this little minute poll at the end of class to sort of see what's on your mind. Someone wrote, I still don't understand this whole Federalist versus Anti-Federalist thing. Let's talk about it. It's actually a good segue. Actually, let me do the second question first. So I'll do the first question second. Does the supremacy clause not apply to Barron because the applicable clause does not specifically name the states? So it's true, right? It's actually a very good question. It's true that the supremacy clause says the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, right? And the Constitution prevails over any state statute. That's true. But does the Constitution say that the supremacy clause applies to the states? And the answer is not. In other words, if the First Amendment says Congress and the states cannot pass religion laws, or if it said Congress and the states can't take property, that'd be fine. But the Constitution's silent about whether the Bill of Rights applies to the states. Yeah, that makes sense? That's why in Barron, the Takings Clause did not limit state power. I want to do this first question, though, this whole Federalist versus Anti-Federalist thing. So let me ask you a question, taking a step back. Who here had ever read a Federalist paper before my law school class? Oh, man, only a couple of hands. That's sad. That makes me very sad. The Federalist Papers were probably the most important statement of political theory in American history. If not, I'll say the world, that's exaggerating, but at least in modern history. Why were the Federalist Papers written? So let's go back to our chronology. In the summer of 1787, we had the Constitutional Convention. If you remember, the purpose of that convention was to propose amendments to the Articles of Confederation to, spruce it up a bit. But early on, the delegates of the convention realized, wait a minute, this Articles thing is not working out. We got to start from scratch. And they ended up writing a brand new Constitution from the floor up. But not everyone in Philadelphia was happy with the Constitution. Even at the convention, people were dissatisfied. George Mason and Luther Martin, Edmund Randolph, a few others. What were they unhappy about? They said, wait a minute, this Constitution has problems. It doesn't have a Bill of Rights. It doesn't protect our rights. This Constitution gives too much power to the central government. It takes power away from the states. All right. So a number of people were in the convention, didn't sign it. Now, in order for the Constitution to become effective, what had to happen? 3/4 of the states had to ratify it. And these are state conventions, groups of people in the states. So after the Constitution was signed in September of 1787, it went to the states. And each state, not every state, but almost every state had a convention where they debated it. They said, should we adopt it or not? At the time, there was no social media, there was no TV. How did people debate things? In pamphlets, in newspapers, right? And it was very common at the time to write under what's called a false name or pseudonym. You know the word pseudonym? Basically a fake name. So there were a group of people who supported the Constitution who were called the Federalists. The Federalists, as they favored the federal government that was being created. And the most prominent Federalists were actually James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, they combined to write the Federalist Papers. This was a series of 78 essays that were published in 1788 that debated various issues of the Constitution. Hamilton wrote most of them, wrote more than half. Madison wrote some, and Jay wrote a handful. Now, what's fascinating about this is that they were not writing only for themselves. They were trying to persuade people in other states to support the Constitution. Now, there's another group of people called the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists. These are people who oppose ratification of the Constitution. And they generally had some grievances. They said, wait a minute, this This Constitution makes the federal government way too strong. And this Constitution makes our rights insecure because there's no Bill of Rights. And the anti-federalists would go line by line through the Constitution and say, look at this. This is going to be really bad. It gives the king, it makes the president like a king. The president has all these war-making powers and command the militia, right? There's no checks and balances. And then the Federalists, Hamilton and Madison mostly, responded saying, no, no, no. They're wrong. We're right. And you actually had this flame war, right? This is a debate in these series of articles and pamphlets during this time. And even in the state conventions where they were debating the Constitution, you had some Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Eventually, 3/4 of the states voted to ratify the Constitution. But the concerns of the Anti-Federalists remained, specifically the lack of a Bill of Rights. And one of the first things done in the very first Congress, James Madison was right there as a representative, was to propose amendments to the Constitution. This was designed to address the valid concerns raised by the Anti-Federalists. So really the reason why we have 10 amendments, why we have a Bill of Rights, is to address the concerns the Anti-Federalists have. And one of them was the Takings Clause we talked about last week. But remember, the Bill of Rights was only designed to limit federal power. The Anti-Federalists, they don't want to limit state power. They want to limit federal power. And that's why the Bill of Rights only limits federal power. The states could keep on keeping on, right? Keep on restricting property rights and religion and so forth. Okay. How's that? All right. What other questions you have before we get going with new stuff? No? All right. Hold on. All right. So our topic for today concerns enumerated powers. Enumerated powers. And let's just sort of start at the very beginning. So I'm going to show on the screen, I think I fit them all at once if everything lines up. Close enough. Okay. There it is. Okay. So there are 3 clauses on the screen. Article 1, Section 1. I'll do it like this so you can all fit. Article 1, Section 1. Article 2, Section 1. And Article 3, Section 1. If you remember, Article 1 concerns the powers of, good, Congress, legislature, good. Article 2 is the power of executive, the president, very good. Article 3, the power of, oh, beautiful. You guys are saying everything right. I'm very happy, good. I will guarantee you 90% of law students can't do that. Like, article what? Right? Someone told me another law professor starts her class with saying, write your own constitutions. That's lovely. We have our own. We're good. Learn ours first, then you can write your own. So Article 1, Section 1 begins, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress, which is a House and Senate. And I want you to just focus on those words. All legislative powers herein granted. What is the significance of this phrase, herein granted? Okay, where did I finish last time? I don't remember. I start calling it people. Who was last that I called on last time?
Marilyn.
Marilyn. Oh, Addie, you're going to be the, yeah.
No, you answered a question.
So are you next, sir? What's your, I can't, oh, that's too small.
Abdullah.
Yeah, keep right. Oh, man, my eyes are just not what they used to be. Abdullah, I can see that. Big and clear. Thank you. Abdullah, let me ask you a question. What's the significance of that language, herein granted? Why is that language important? What does that mean, herein granted?
Meaning that if it comes from there, that...
Where's there? You said
the
there.
Legislative.
Where does Congress get their powers from? Where are Congress's powers granted, if I can say it like that? Read it. Read Article 1, Section 1. Read it to you. Read it to me.
All legislative powers here granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United
Okay, and where does this sentence appear?
States. The first sentence.
Of which document?
Article 1, Section 1.
Of the...
Constitution.
Good. So where does Congress get its powers from?
The Constitution.
Exactly. Does Congress have any powers that are not granted in the Constitution?
Yes.
Let me ask the question again. Maybe that's negative. Does Congress have any powers that are not granted in the Constitution?
No.
Are all of Congress's powers herein granted in the Constitution?
Yes.
Correct. Okay. This is something that everyone agrees upon, I think. Maybe not everyone, but I think most people agree upon this one. Whatever powers that Congress has are granted in the Constitution. Full stop. Right? This isn't like a king that has, divine powers that come from, the heavens, right? Where they can do sort of whatever they wish. If you ask a question, does Congress have the power to do X? Whatever X is, you must look in our, Constitution. It's very small. And Congress's powers appear in what was the first question I asked you all today? Article 1, Section? Better. Article 1, Section 8. Right? It lists power to tax, power to make coins, this and so on. Right? All of Congress's powers are listed in Article 1, Section 8. But remember, what is the last provision of Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18? Beautifully noted. Clause 18 is. That is the big one. That is the sweeping clause. It sweeps very broadly. Almost everything Congress does is actually under the necessary and proper clause. Don't forget that. All right, everyone with me with Article 1, Section 1. Okay, you're over there. Oscar, so, okay, let's go to the next one. Article 2, Section 1. This is the powers of which branch? You don't have to guess. Right, it says it right there, black and white. The executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States. He shall hold for 4 years, blah, blah, blah. Oscar, just, like compare and contrast, right? How does Article 1, Section 1 and Article 2, Section 1 differ? Just the language. How are they different? There's an important difference. How are they different?
I mean, it kind of, I guess the Constitution's both giving them power. It says that both starts off with shall be vested, so it's that same in that way. But the other way, it's saying that this is like one person, and it says a specific amount of years that one person, and that they can have a vice president with them.
That's correct. So you're right. All the executive power is vested not in a body, but in a single uno, right? That was important. During the convention, they debated maybe having 3 presidents or having like a council. And the framers, Hamilton in particular, said, no, you must have a strong, vigorous, unitary executive. Someone has to be in charge. They went to see Tony Busby yesterday, right? Someone's got to be in charge. You must have one person leading the show, or else you don't have a country. You don't have anything. And that was going to be the president. You can't have a, because look, if there's 3 people in charge, who's going to take responsibility? Oh, you do the hard work. No, you do it. Who takes responsibility if something goes wrong? Who's accountable? You need uno, one. So is that Carolina?
Yes.
Carolina. But there's this phrase here in granted that Abdullah talked about a minute ago. Does that language appear in Article 2? Here and granted? It's not there. What's the significance of the fact that language here and granted is not there? Why is that significant that in Article 2, this phrase here and granted does not appear?
Because for Section 1, Congress can only have what is enumerated in the Constitution, and someone like powers on the second, it doesn't mean that it has to be enumerated in the Constitution.
Do the president's powers have to be enumerated? Ooh, you're correct, but just tell me why. What is the executive power? Does it say the executive power is here and granted? Is that what it says? So what does it tell us?
Carry out.
All right, so this is an issue in which people don't agree. Right. Article 1, Section 1, everyone agrees you have to have powers that are listed. Everyone agrees on that one. I'm not going to get a debate on that one. This one, though, people have a vigorous disagreement upon. And I'm just going to, I try to be balanced. If I fail, I apologize. But I always try to give both sides as best as I can. There's one school of thought that says, wait a minute. This phrase here and granted is not there. That means the president may have powers that are not granted in the Constitution. But what might those powers be? Well, what is this executive power? Well, maybe we look at, what powers did governors exercise in the colonies after independence? Maybe we look at what powers the king might have exercised. Maybe look at the executive powers that rules in other nations exercise, right? This is what's often called the unitary executive theory. The unitary executive theory. It was very popular during the George Bush administration and the George W. Bush administration. It seems to be on the decline now. The theory goes like this. There's one president, like Oscar said, and he has this broad set of powers called the executive power, like Carolina said. And we don't know what those powers are. But he's vested with these powers. But this is called the vesting clause. Vesting, V-E-S-T-A-N-G, the vesting clause. If all these powers are vested in the president, those are the president's powers. Now, Shelton, let me ask you a question, please. If the president has an executive power vested in him, can Congress take that power away?
No.
Why not?
Because under the Constitution, which trumps whatever legislation.
Right. Under which clause? How do we know that? Which clause tells us that? Our quiz question from 5 minutes ago.
Supremacy clause.
Right. So let's say Congress passes a statute saying, you know what, President, we don't like you handing all these pardons, right? You're handing out too many of these damn pardons, right? We're going to pass a statute saying you can't issue a pardon after the election. In other words, no more lame duck pardons. Can Congress do that by statute?
I don't think so, but it really has the right.
Correct. So if there's an executive power vested in the president, Congress cannot take that power away. It's vested in the president by the Constitution, and Congress cannot take it away. Yes, sir, Brian.
If they're coming off like a revolution where they're trying to get away from a king, why would they not list specifically?
Oh, such a good question. One of the biggest fears of the Anti-Federalists was that we created another king, that we gave the president too many powers. And the Federalists assures us, no, 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 trust us. This person's controlled. We're going to do executive power in about a month. And I want you to ask me the same question in about a month. But there's an entire Federalist paper. I think it's, oh, God. President, not king. It's in the 60s. Which number is it? 69. Yeah, I knew it was in the 60s. Federalist 69, if you want to Google it, you can read it. It's not very long. But Hamilton exactly discusses in what ways is the president like a king and in what ways is the president not like a king. And he says there's some similarities, but there's many differences. And this is actually in response to an anti-Federalist paper. It's by Federal Farmer, or is it Brutus? I can't remember, where they go back and forth. So, but the question, Brian, you're asking is a very good one. Okay. All right, Elizabeth, let's move on. Let's go to the last. These are the three vesting clauses, right? There's the legislative vesting clause in Article 1. There's the legislative vesting clause, I'm sorry, the executive vesting clause in Article 2, and the judicial vesting clause in Article 3. Right? So, Elizabeth, what sort of strikes you about the judicial vesting clause in Article 3? Why is that language significant? What does that resemble? Does it say the power is here and granted? So which one does it more closely resemble? Yeah, so Article 3, Section 1, the judicial clause sort of resembles Article 2, right? But where is this power vested, Elizabeth? Is it vested in a single person? Well, actually, it's not in the justices. It's in the Supreme Court. Don't forget that. The members of the court don't have the power. It's the court that has the power. You're right. But the power is vested in the Supreme Court and where else, Elizabeth? That who's they? Does the Supreme Court establish those other courts? Who? Okay. Elizabeth, does Congress have to create inferior courts? Do they have to give them any judicial power? Do you give them some judicial power? Yeah. So let me just blow your minds for a minute, right? Civil procedure, right? You all took Civ Pro. Federal question jurisdiction, right? If a case arises under the Constitution, right, you have federal jurisdiction. Does Congress have to give the federal courts federal question jurisdiction? No, they do not. They do not. For much of the 19th century, there was no federal question jurisdiction. The only way you got to federal court was diversity. Did you know that? Do you know why? As Congress from May from time to time ordained and established, Congress has a choice to give the judicial power to the lower courts. They have the choice. You know, why is the amount of controversy $75,000? Is that in the Constitution? No. Congress can choose what barriers are needed to get yourself in federal court. Do you know this? It's because of this clause. Congress can choose. They have no obligation to create federal courts, lower courts, and they have no obligation to vest them with any jurisdiction. All right. I'll give you one more, though. But for the U.S. Supreme Court, Conrad, let's go back to Marbury. Can Congress mess with the Supreme Court's original jurisdiction?
No.
Why not?
Because the original jurisdiction comes from the Constitution.
Right there. The Supreme Court is effectively created by the Constitution itself. Could Congress abolish the Supreme Court tomorrow?
No, not an amendment.
No. Could they abolish the Circuit Courts of Appeals?
Yes.
And they've done that. They might want to. Right. But they cannot get rid of the Supreme Court. So no matter what happens, we can have no lower courts, but my God, the U.S. Supreme Court has jurisdiction over ambassador cases. They will have that to the end of time. But again, it's not judicial powers here and granted. Bobby, does the Supreme Court, I'm sorry, does the Constitution tell us what these judicial powers are? Is that anywhere in the Constitution?
No.
Does it say the power to decide cases, declare unconstitutional, any of that stuff in the Constitution? So how do we know then what judicial power is if it's not in the Constitution?
By inferring that by making the Supreme Court and also giving them the power to establish lower courts, that there has to be some kind of efficacy.
Where might we look to determine the powers of judicial review? Where might we try and figure what those powers are? Judicial power. What might we study?
The Federalist Papers?
Go back further, Blake.
Article 3, Section 1.
Well, it doesn't tell you much in there. What might we study, Blake? If we have courts in the 1790s, what might we study to see what happened? What might we study to figure out what that judicial power might be?
The courts of England.
Yes, the same way to Brian's question a minute ago that we let me look to the King's executive powers. Maybe look to the Britain judiciary. Everyone understand that? All right. So what we have here are these three vesting clauses. These establish our frames of government. The powers of Congress are fixed. They're only enumerated. They're listed here and granted. The powers of the president, maybe they're only those listed in the Constitution. Some people think that. Other people think that, in fact, it's broader. 1 second. Let's see if I can get you a second. And then you have the powers of the courts, which are not spelled out, but it falls to the courts to decide what their own authority is. Yes, Stephen?
With the judicial power, I thought that it was more like what we kind of did on the first day, which is like natural law, kind of like the Magna Carta was like what we started with about what judicial power is.
How do you know that?
Did we talk about it?
We talked about it. You're sitting here 200 years later. I mean, when the Constitution is written, how do you know what that means? In other words, how do you know that the judicial power embraces natural law? It doesn't say that in the Constitution, does it? Right. But if you read, and someone said Federalist Papers, that's not a wrong answer, but it sort of starts the clock a little bit too late. We had traditionally back, as you said, to Magna Carta. You can't be taken away without the judgment of your peers, right? This long tradition of due process. What process is due? By the way, what does due process mean? What process you do? What does the law obligate you to have before your stuff's taken away, before you're imprisoned, before your property is seized? So yes, there's a long tradition, and absolutely there's a natural law component here as well, right? The entire idea of the supremacy clause, that you follow the higher law, they didn't make that up in Philadelphia. That concept goes back to ancient times. There was a higher law, God, right? Whatever it is, you follow the higher law, whatever it happens to be in any society. And here our highest law is the Constitution, and that's what you follow as a higher law. Questions? All right. So let's take another step back and start talking about another prominent debate during the Philadelphia Convention, right? And this was the issue of slavery. We're going to return to slavery in the second half of the semester. I think it's after spring break when we do Dred Scott. But this issue is lurking since the Republic was founded. When you get to 1787, the nation was roughly split in half. In the northern states, which basically means Pennsylvania and above, slavery was, if not abolished, was on the trajectory of being abolished. And the states varied how they approach it, but the northern states, more or less, slavery is in the path of being abolished in almost every state. Pennsylvania in particular was a very what they call abolitionist state. They were very much opposed to slavery. Now on the other side of Pennsylvania, I'll just show you a map. If you're watching the videos, you've seen this already. You should have. I'm assigning it, but anyway. So on the exact other side of the Pennsylvania border, you have Maryland. Maryland was a vigorous slave state. You don't think of Maryland as a southern state, but it really was back in the time. And the southern state